So that's been my project all last year, was to find out what really did happen that wasn't sensationalized, that was more specific to what was happening in Northern California. So that's where I began my quest, talking about the fact that there was the general population knows somewhat of the Elliot Ness story, if you those of us who remember that, or something else that was related to crime and that kind of thing, where that's all popular and it's not fiction, but it didn't relate to us. So there's a whole bunch of stereotypes that are not related to us at all, and that's what got me going. So New York City and San Francisco had reputations of being the wettest cities in the United States. Uh, Baltimore wants to say we were in that list as well, and Detroit also says, "Oh, what about us?" So those were the top four, and I can't tell you how they're organized. But anyway, San Francisco ignored the law, closed eyes to violation, participated uh, in basically in violating everything. Basically, San Francisco practiced nullification of the 18th Amendment. Uh, that is fairly true, but I will clarify a few bits and pieces of this. If you take a look at the map on the right side, you can see that all the colored counties are all going to act pretty much the same as San Francisco. So this was the idea that Marin, Sonoma, Napa all had some invested interest in winemaking. We forget about it, but there was definitely vineyards right outside of San Rafael. So, and as you get on the other side of the map, San Mateo County was really hot. I mean, they really had a lot of issues going on in San Mateo County, Contra Costa County, towards the bay. In other words, you touched the bay, you were probably had the same set of values as those who lived a little further inland. And so all those counties are all pretty much going to operate along the same lines. The most notable exceptions to Walker's quote were the Santa Clara County, Eastern Alameda County, and Eastern Contra Costa County could be a little drier than the people closer to the coast. Again, it's individuals, but there is some background to that story. Most U.S. newspapers talked an awful lot about the finding of stills and having that picture in the local newspaper and all that kind of stuff. They like to show pouring alcohol down the drain and that kind of thing. But the reality was the Bay Area newspapers were pretty good about not doing this. There's a couple of pictures that I've found, but they're really not as they're not sensationalizing it as much as other places in the United States. Obviously, if liquor is found in Kansas, it made the Kansas City Star immediately. So this is not what was going on in our community, because our community was somewhat more forgiving, maybe, let's just say that. At least it was definitely not as not out of shape about the fact that there is alcohol out there. So wine, spirits, beer had a colorful history in San Francisco and in the Bay Area. So just looking in a San Francisco directory, you can see that, I don't remember the date of that directory, whoops. The date is cut off, so I can't remember for sure. But anyway, 31 breweries were in San Francisco. That's a lot of breweries. Wholesale liquor, a good 115 said that that's what their business was. Retail liquor, bars, etc., hotels, it's very hard to know the number. It's about 3,000, but all hotels usually had a liquor license. And of course, there was plenty of retail, of actual gin joints and that kind of thing that were out there as well. We were also a major mover of the product. You can see in the top left corner there that there is a ship, and a smaller ship comes out to the bigger ship, and they're either loading or unloading. It appears possibly they are unloading. Can't tell for sure. Lower left is Whelan's Brewery, one of the many breweries in San Francisco, and I threw the Italian Swiss Colony because that was their hub. So the liquor, I mean, the wine would come from a lot of regions. It came from Santa Clara Valley. Almaden, for example, comes to mind. They came from other counties, and we know Sonoma, we know Napa, and there was a lot of counties, and all their product came for distribution or for warehousing in San Francisco before the earthquake and fire. After the earthquake and fire, we're going to have a little bit of different perspective, but that's basically it. So it becomes a national thing. It had started before the First World War. There was a lot of righteousness about this. Of course, the WCTU, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, had long been campaigning for this. At one point, it was the two organizations, the women's suffrage movement and the Prohibition movement, had joined forces up until about 1894-5, where they split apart. The women pretty much said, we'll never get the vote if we're going to be hamstrung by somebody who is much more righteous about alcohol. So they kind of split themselves off at that point. Let me see what I did. No, I'm right. Okay. So I'm right there. A lot of sheet music from the time period. What'll we do on Saturday night when the town goes dry? So they all knew it was coming. They voted for things and so forth. And so the producers of sheet music had their cute little ditties about, how difficult it's going to be when we go dry. And that's the 18th Amendment to the Constitution, prohibited the manufacture, sale, purchase, transport, export, or import or export of alcoholic beverages, but didn't they say anything about consumption? So consumption was not covered. Only all the exchange of money and the moving things around was covered, but not the consumption. So that will be one of the wedges that is used throughout this game, throughout the years of Prohibition, of getting around what the law said, and you could still drink. So it was a rather interesting way of dealing with things. I want to bring up the progressive movement. So the progressive movement, at the time, there was an election in 1911, in October of 1911, in which women's suffrage was on the ballot. Now, don't get me wrong here, because women's suffrage only related to local issues and state issues. We don't get federal. You couldn't vote for the senator. You could not vote for the representatives. You could not vote for the president under this particular set of rules, because it was a California issue, not a national issue. Okay, so when the vote came up in October 10th of 1911, the women's suffrage portion of that ballot was voted no. It was voted no in San Francisco, and it passed because of rural and Southern California. And of course, majority rule wins. So it was passed. The 18th Amendment the suffrage amendment was passed by somebody other than San Francisco. Remember, women are not voting for their own rights. It's men who have to grant them their rights. And so pretty much, as far as I can determine, the men were rather anxious about the fact that if women got the vote, they would vote for prohibition, and that would be terrible in terms of what the men thought they should be able to drink whenever they wanted, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So basically, the men were afraid that if the women got the vote, their issues would be to eliminate the ability to purchase and transport and all the other stuff of alcohol. So that's why San Francisco had a lot of power in this issue, but the state carried it. Who would have thought that Los Angeles and San Diego and other parts of the state had that much clout and were able to pass women's suffrage in 1911, but they did. 1919, the same thing came up. Ratification of the 18th Amendment. It had already gone through Congress. It already came out to the states to be ratified, and same thing. Southern California, legislation was rejected, the 18th Amendment, Southern California and rural California approved. I mean, that's the 18th Amendment, of course, that's women's suffrage. So that's the national issue. Socially, why were we so different? The Bay Area had a very large population of European immigrants, Irish, Italians, Greeks, French, Germans, all had part of their culture was to have alcohol. So the idea that they would be restricted from using alcohol was really anathema to them. Southern California had a great number of American-born transplants from the Midwest, and they were the dries. So Bay Area already had a reputation with all as much consumption of alcohol and much transportation, the economy that was based upon some form of liquor. And so we had a much more positive attitude towards alcohol and a very negative attitude towards the prohibition of the use of alcohol. So it came down to two simple words, wet and dry. We were considered wet. Southern California was considered dry. So it breaks down the same way, but for a different issue here. All right, economically. San Francisco was the hub of the alcoholic beverage industry in the West prior to 1920, prior to the onset of Prohibition. We had breweries in San Francisco that brewed, kegged, and bottled local beers, and the beer was consumed and transported out of San Francisco. Wholesale liquor companies were all located in San Francisco, where they stored it, they shipped it, they did all the processing. You'll notice the pictures that I've chosen up here. When it comes down to wine, wine grapes are still being grown in Napa and Sonoma. I didn't even talk about Santa Clara Valley because they're kind of a blue-nosed county beyond that. And so what happened was San Francisco then was, again, very positive towards anything alcoholic. And by the post-earthquake and fire, there is a new hub for where that went on. So many of those warehouses that were down on the north side of Telegraph Hill were burned out or whatever else, not all of them, but many of them. And so a new plan came up for Napa and Sonoma counties. If they brought it down to a place called California Wine Association place they called Wine Haven. And this was basically Point Richmond. The Western Pacific came down there and had a transfer point, and they had a very long pier so ships could come in and get the wine. It had a problem because it wasn't very long before oil is discovered, and where were they going to refine oil? Right next door to Wine Haven. So Wine Haven is still there, a gorgeous building, but it lost its function rather quickly between Prohibition and the fact that Standard Oil moved in and started refining in that same area. So, all right. So before Prohibition took effect on January 16th, there was a whole movement to stock up your warehouse, stock up your cellar. Sheet music, the same thing. Everybody wants a key to my cellar, and the same thing. Smart little feller who stocked up his cellar is going to get the girl. So these kind of Tin Pan Alley stuff was there, but up to the last minute, everybody's kind of filling up their garage, their outbuilding or whatever else with liquor, and that will be a problem going forward. All right, so we have January 18th, the same basic week. This is the first source of where you're going to get liquor in California, but primarily we're talking about the Bay Area. If you had bought liquor prior to January 16th of 1920, and you had a receipt for that liquor, you were good to go. You could, until you drank it up, nobody could say, well, you're paying for it after Prohibition started. No, you paid for it before. So it would be a hot spot to to do a little robbery if you went to the warehouses or private homes or their cellars, former saloons and bars. These were all areas where the agents had to kind of walk a fine line as to whether or not they were going to make a bust. And the first thing you said is, "Oh no, I bought it the week before Prohibition started." You were good to go, particularly if you carried some documentation, said, "I got a receipt right here." So the first place you're going to get your liquor is if you've stored it already and someone stole it from you. It just becomes a simple robbery as opposed to anything in the Volstead Act. The second place that you could get your liquor was something they called a soft drink parlor. Now, when the rules came down on after January 16th, all the saloons were to remove all signage. As you see on the far left there, we've got the Eagle Bar and the whiskey and so forth. You had to remove your signs. Now, what are you going to do with that space? Oh, we're going to become a soft drink parlor. And there was many of these, the breweries had actually, they had the bottling line, so they went into making soft drinks. So there's a whole bunch of them, and I have a whole bunch of pictures, but I just threw up this one called Aspen Glow. And it was, in this case, it was a San Francisco firm called General Enterprise Company. This was your mixers. So when you went to a bar, a soft drink parlor, you asked for a particular soft drink. And of course, that was like, that's your mixer. And so either you brought your liquor in with you, or they worked out something so that you got some liquor to put into your glass. We did not use the word speakeasy very much. The press did not use the word speakeasy because really nobody was doing any kind of surreptitious, quiet discussion or having a password. You walked right in. And if they knew you, you're set up. It's all set. The lower right corner, I just took a raid from Marin County, both San Rafael and Sausalito. But the bottom line is where I underlined it because they didn't know what to call it. That's a long bit. Soft drink parlor. That's 3 words. If you can simplify it so you can see what they called it, if I can see it myself here. I wish we could drop Yvonne and Robert out of there, but anyway. So I've lost the word. What is it there? Can I get into it? I don't think so. No, I can't. All right. That's the problem I have with this, is that there's I'll lose things that we have all the faces on the right side. Anyway, you can read it. I can't read it. Moving on from there. So they didn't know quite what to do. Essentially, where were these things? In San Francisco, they were in the Tenderloin, 6th Street, all that kind of stuff, North Beach. When you got into smaller towns in Marin or Sonoma, they were right near the train station. So there was always a soft drink parlor close by, which had formerly been a saloon. And that was the kind of the way it all worked. There's lines that come, that somebody came into Sausalito and said, where can I get a drink? And they pointed towards a cross on the hill. That's the Catholic church. That's the only place you can't get a drink. The same story is told from another community and say you can get a drink anywhere except the post office. Now, it was that kind of thing. It was so open. It was quite remarkable how open it was. All right. So when you're rating retail liquor sales, okay? Soft drink parlor raided, owner and employees arrested, agent sees roadhouse in the county towns in Sonoma and Marin. Dry Squadron, they will call it the Dry Squad, or in this case, the Dry Squadron. They made their moves. Military raiders penetrate Sonoma County as far as Petaluma. Woo! They're going to get you, folks. This is just, it shows up in the San Francisco Chronicle. Lower one, after raiding the Santa Rosa restaurant, the agents proceeded to Cloverdale and made a raid on Toscano Hotel, where they arrested one guy for having whiskey. Most of these things got thrown out very quickly. The judges were not sympathetic to this at all, but that's exactly how it came down. In other words, someone has imposed a law upon us we don't agree with, and we're going to do everything we can to avoid going along with the program. That's exactly how their thinking was. So the lower right corner, I say the Proby, which is the name they use more often than anything else. They surely didn't use revenue man. we're making would come into Marin and Sonoma County occasionally. Most of their concentration was San Francisco and San Mateo County. And they would stop off on their way ahead for a little visit to, Boys Hot Springs and El Verano and Agua Caliente, all these places that we all recognize the names of, which were places where people spent time for recreation, primarily for their health. All of them, you could get liquor if you wanted. But again, these guys are all small potatoes, and the Prohibition people are really grasping at trying to make a showing, and their showing is rather feeble. Okay, first few years of the Volstead Act, Volstead Act's enforcement, the Dry Squad spent a lot of time doing petty enforcement. Much of it was dismissed because of shoddy legality. So the judges basically said, bring me the evidence. Whoops. Well, I saw the guy drinking. I saw someone pouring it. Bring me the evidence. So it was a way of the local police force, in this case, the judges, to stay away from even dealing with it, because they got to say, this is not our problem. It's a problem. It's federal. At that point, only the Volstead Act was a national set of rules that only was to be enforced by the Prohibition officers, which meant that the local police could say, not me, not our problem. And so they basically, they could, if they really wanted to get hard-nosed with somebody, basically they did not. They stayed away from it for the first 2 years. I'll explain what happens into the second year. So what they would do is they would sometimes impose very high fines to make a showing, to make a demonstration case. By the time it went through a couple of hearings, the case was reduced. Not many people served much time. I say in the lower section of this page, in the 13 years of Prohibition enforcement, the Northern California office in San Francisco had 11 probation department administrative changes. Now, if you work for anybody and see that many changes over a course of 13 years, you know something's not working, and it wasn't. They appointed people, many of them had been military, middle-level military during the First World War. The salary was low, particularly for the administrators. It was low for the people who actually did the grunt work. The quality of people you got was not very high because there was no civil service exam that these guys had to pass. In fact, one of the actual Prohibition leaders, he was a chairman of his department, or the department administrator. He couldn't pass it. He took it 3 times and couldn't pass it. Eventually, they bounced him. Actually, he did a very good job. His name was Green. He was quite righteously did his job, but he couldn't pass the test. When they finally came around to say, well, everybody's going to pass civil service. In the beginning, none of that existed. Low conviction rate. They got very few people who they could actually convict of anything. And this is demoralizing to someone who's trying to do a job where they don't get any cooperation from the people in authority. And of course, it's a minimal public cooperation as well. So the public is not, take a look over there. There was some of that, obviously, but in general, no, people were not even cooperating. They're not going along with the program. In a county like Sonoma, you had a sheriff. You elected the sheriff. You knew who he was. His kids might have played with your kids. That kind of thing. He's not going to bust you. He's going to maybe say, hey, I think you got to take it easy, or somebody else is going to bust you. So the local authorities didn't cooperate either. And that makes it even harder to take and enforce a federal ruling that sounds so wonderful, but the infrastructure from there on in falls apart. Here. All right, so there's another way people are going to get their liquor, and that is another source. Cartoon, which is a postcard actually, was the drugstore. Cheer up, little barroom. don't you cry, you'll be a drugstore by and by. So if you close down the bar, or you could go to the drugstore. It wasn't quite that simple. There's a couple of steps to make that happen, but essentially that was one of the sources, because the drugstores were carrying something called spiritus fermenti. And if you have any Latin in your, you can make that out of Latin alone. It is not, essentially, it's fermented spirits. And you can see these are real prescription, real bottle labels and that kind of stuff. A wine on the left, and the two on the right was Four Roses, which carried on till today. So what happened? First of all, you had to go and you get a prescription filled by your farm. First, you had to go see a physician, and the physician had to write you a prescription. On that prescription, it said that you could go to the drugstore and you could have this prescription filled, just as if you were going for, your heart medicine or whatever else. And then the second thing is it had to be filled by the pharmacist. Well, you can see the picture in the center, low center there out of Sausalito, where they simply closed down a drugstore for a year because they were operating outside of the rules. Were probably dispensing a lot more liquor than they had receipts for or prescriptions for, or some other way there was that kind of thing. So the disadvantage, of course, is they didn't give you much. They only gave you a small amount at a time. And so you'd have to go get another prescription or that kind of thing, or you got familiar with the druggist and he could kind of do it under the table. And that's probably why that Sausalito drugstore got busted. All right, let's see what I got here. Oops, I'm going way over there. Well, I got another way of doing that. All right. Something's going on that I cannot get. I cannot advance. So do you have this as well, Patricia? Can you see what I see? Something is going on so that I cannot advance my next slide. Ah, there it is. Okay, patience. Another piece of sheet music called "Oh Doctor." The best line of that whole thing is, write the prescription and please make it say, take with your meals. I eat 10 times a day. So, Tin Pan Alley cuteness and so forth. So what does the prescription look like? I have a couple of prescription blanks there, but what was your doctor saying your problem was? In this case, I never had seen one before. It came out of San Francisco. It basically said the ailment of which for which prescribed senile weakness. I don't know what that means. When I forget the things, is that senile weakness? I'm not sure. Do I need a little tonic for that? I'm not quite sure. So there was limits on how many prescriptions a month that a doctor could prescribe. Everybody knew there was a way around that and so forth. All right. San Francisco dry officers at war. Woman blames Democrats for the liquor muddle. That's kind of thing goes on. Oh, it's the other, the Democrats were pretty much considered to be the wets, and the Republicans were considered to be the dries. Now, obviously, you saw from that last image that the men who were probably Republicans were just as wet as the working man, but this game gets played no matter where you go. So, U.S. Dry Heads Review Year of Prohibition, and basically said, "Oh, we're doing just great. We got them on the run. It's frequent. The declares Day of the Frequent Drinker nears end. Progress being made." That's all fluff. That is absolutely fluff. Because on the other side, we have the dry laws are not being followed, and people are admitting in some cases that there's something wrong with this whole process. So you got rules, but you don't have cooperation with people. Sound like a familiar drug that we all have been living with called marijuana? I mean, it's kind of similar in many ways. So by November of 1922, went on the ballot, the initiative process, where it said, okay, we got a problem here. We got a federal law, but we cannot get the local constabulary, the police, the sheriff, to go along with it because they said that's a federal problem. Call the probies, call prohibition people. We're not involved in that. So what they did is they passed legislation and was voted upon. Again, Southern California went along with it. Northern California did not. That the Volstead Act could now be, it was called the Right Act at the time. And basically it's saying that the local police or sheriff can now have authority to do the same thing that the federals do. In other words, you can make the arrest, you can do the interrogation, you can do the rest of that kind of stuff. Not saying it worked, but at least it did free up the hands. And of course, the Dries were real excited because they think, oh boy, the local sheriff is really going to take these guys down. Not very often. You had to have abused it in some way, or you have had to have, let's just say you and the sheriff weren't getting along anyway. All right. So, prohibition enforcement, enforcement desperation. May of 1926, President Coolidge signs an executive order to allow deputizing volunteer citizens to act as prohibition agents with unlimited jurisdiction, including even to go outside their own state. Well, I think we've got a states' rights issue going on here. Wets predict the country will be overrun with anti-saloon league zealots who, in their eagerness to see the law enforced, will obtain local appointments and run rampant over the country. And that's essentially the backstory of what went on. So these people were called $1 a year dry police. You can see the center one there says there's 200 join in Southern California. It had, you can just imagine the amount of problems that would be if you suddenly are deputizing all kinds of people and say, go out and hunt them down for us and we'll follow up, that kind of stuff. Or they gave them carte blanche. You can pull a gun on somebody and say, okay, here's my tin badge and you're going to go with me and all that kind of stuff. It fell apart very quickly, but you can see the president of the United States, old Cal Coolidge, he's, well, executive order is the way to go and solve our problem right there. So it's not working. And you can tell it's not working when you start looking at the evidence that was in the newspapers, particularly a Bay Area newspaper, in this case, most of it's from the Chronicle. An Examiner was no different. They were all the same. And the call was still, no, it had phased out by that time. All right. So there's a 4.1. How are you going to get your liquor? Well, you can make your alcoholic beverage at home. And so some enterprising people there was two of them. I'll talk about a third one later. Something called Vino Sano grape brick. It's about the size of that form of butter that you would find in that kind of a brick. The ones that Trader Joe's sells, that's the way they look. Some of them still use a flatter version of that. And so essentially it's saying that this is, each brick dissolves in 1 gallon of water. To prevent fermentation, add 1/10 of 1% of benzoate of soda. So in other words, here's the warning on the back label. Warning, after dissolving the brick in a gallon of water, do not place the liquid in a jug away from away in the cupboard for 20 days, because then it might turn into wine. So they get around this thing by saying, oh, well, this is what you're not supposed to do, which obviously says this is what you do. So kind of interesting. Another one that was actually put up by the Gallo family, and this one was called, I've lost it there from the face, Wine Glow, I believe. Wine Glow. Same idea. You could mail away and get one of these bricks, and then you could do it at home. They took out the fermentation process, but they taught you how to do it. Very smart. How about beer? Well, beer gets kind of sidetracked. One of the problems, why was it even on the list? is because we had just had a war with Germany. We were very anti-German. And how do you get back at the Germans? Take away their beer. So there was a lot of animosity towards anybody who had a German name or whatever else. You've heard some of that, you know, sauerkraut becomes Liberty cabbage and those kinds of things. This is carried out in the whole prohibition process, where you are going to be you're not, you can't buy, you can buy an imitation beer. They'll never call it beer, they'll call it a brew. And it was basically what we call a near beer. Near beer was not a popular term, it was kind of a derogatory term. So the various breweries, which simply boil it down so it was less alcohol, and it's one half of 1%. That's not much alcohol. And they could sell it, but you could make it at home. And of course, where do you go up to Hopland? You've got plenty of hops. So we had a lot of hops being produced in northern Sonoma County into Lake County. So you definitely have, or maybe Mendocino, is it? Not sure. Anyway, these are all products that are readily available. Didn't cost any. I mean, you had to do it yourself. But again, it's getting around a law by making the ingredients are not forbidden. It's making beer product that's making. But there's a rule, and the rule is rather interesting. It's the 200-gallon rule. So within that legislation, it bounced out. So it got to the point where any family could make up to 200 gallons of a fruit wine. In this case, it was kind of on the edge of whether or not making beer was okay, but it got under that same kind of jurisdiction. And so people are making beer at home. It's a lot more work to make beer over wine. So it didn't have as much popularity. Obviously, it went over very well in Milwaukee and St. Louis, but not necessarily on the West Coast. Not that I'm saying you didn't have Germans. It was just a lot more work and not as. But we had the hops, and we were exporting these hops both domestically. We were using them as well as exporting them to other countries. So 4.3. The bounty from Napa and Sonoma County vineyards. This is the 1925 harvest, Pier 11, San Francisco. The wineries that were still, or at least vineyards, let's say they're vineyards, the vineyards that were still in operating would then use these boxes, and there was plenty of these companies that made these boxes. At harvest time, they would fill up the boxes with grapes, and they would bring them down to San Francisco. And in San Francisco, they brought them in boxcars. You could see the empties. And the process was simply, you went there. If you had a truck, or sometimes an enterprising guy would get them and drive right down Columbus Avenue, right through the Italian neighborhood of North Beach, and sell the amount of grapes that you wish to buy, and then you took it home and you made your own wine. So that was another workaround that was done. Every harvest, there was no problem to sell wine, sell grapes. The problem was you couldn't sell the finished product. So many of these northern Italians, particularly, had already done that at home. They had been in the old country. This was common. They made wine every fall. So it was not a new idea to them or a new skill they had to learn. And many of our Italians, particularly in Marin and Sonoma, were northern Italians. Even in San Francisco, northern Italians. The fishing people tended to be from Sicily or southern Italy. The people who were in other occupations who were from Italy were from northern Italy, and those two people couldn't even talk. They had such a different language. Well, anyway, there was like two different worlds. But the Italians were resourceful. They all knew how to get by in Italy, scraping, get by, avoid the authorities whenever possible. So it was a match set. I mean, it was a really easy set of skills that came here. And this is a very nice that I have a picture that I can find a picture of this process. Same thing. Bertucci mobile grape crusher. Okay, so you simply, that's Bertucci's. He's converted an old truck. He's got a big tank on there, and you put the grapes in the top, and it crushed on site for you. Winemaking in the home, everybody had to have a wine press so that you could squeeze the grapes yourselves. So it became kind of a very cultural thing for the Italians, the French as well, but we did not have as large a population of French, but definitely the Italians were big on this. Heads of the family may manufacture 200 gallons per year. Okay, that would take you about 1,009, 1,009 750 milliliter bottles. That's a lot of bottles. That's drinking a lot. Or if you want to translate it another way, it would be like 4 gallons per family per week. That's a lot of booze. So it was a very crazy little quirk in the law that allowed people to skim right by all the rules. And of course, who's got the grapes? We got the grapes. So what about Gravenstein apples? Terrible, would never work. Wrong kind of apple. You need a tart apple to get cider. You don't get cider from the sweeter Gravenstein. So it wasn't something that was, it says fruit wine, and you can make it out of any kind of fruit you want, but of course, the best was always going to be the grapes. So the biggest Prohibition success story out of Sonoma County is the Asti grape products. It's a very complex story. Essentially, family members, and there's 2 people named Rossi who are twins that are not related to any other Rossis. I mean, it's a rather interesting mix of people. But basically, these were hardworking Italians who took a lot of risks. They're up in the area generally of Cloverdale. So they would make their product, they would produce their product, and then the U did the fermentation. They didn't get involved in fermentation. They just simply provided the goods for you to go from there. So they would ship the grapes to San Francisco in boxcars, as the last picture showed, to be taken home by customers, or have the fruit crushed at the nearby railing near the rail lines. There would be a building that was owned by Asti, and they would do the crushing for you, and they would take out the stems and do all that kind of good stuff. So there was workarounds no matter where you turn. The batches of grapes went through the stemmer crusher, and the customer could take home the juice in 15 or 20 gallon barrels. The fermentation process was done by the customer with instructions on when to add the yeast and all that, to make this process successful. So again, another workaround by people from, these 2 agricultural counties were doing this kind of thing. The other one was the wine brick. And this is Asti did their own process of wine bricks. I have not seen a label for it, although I think the Italian Swiss Tupo was a pre and post, and the Italian Swiss jumps around a few times. Who's it owned by now? Foster's Lager of Australia. I mean, it's never stayed in one Italian family for very long, and you keep selling things off. Anyway, the wine bricks. You compress the grape pumice, saturate it with a little more grape concentrate, and then you didn't freeze it, but you put it into into cold storage. The advantage for Italian Swiss was that they could then avoid all that garbage that went on, that everybody wants their grapes all at once. It's all going to be when the harvest comes in, which is probably anywhere from the beginning of September to the first 2 weeks of October, depending on the year, of course. And so they now could send that wherever they wanted, because they've delayed the process. It's a wine brick, same thing. Do not do this, but be sure if you put your dry yeast in at this particular time, you don't want to do that, because you might make yourself wine. So these guys were clever. Okay, the public preferred their wine to have a deep red color. So Alicante Boucher grapes. This is a southern French grape. Had a thick skin, and it had The problem with wine grapes, you just don't start making raisins out of that. The wine grape has all the essence of good wine is in the skin, not in the pulp. So they all vary, and it's the tannins and all that kind of stuff is in the skin, and grape and also having the seeds and all that kind of stuff is all part of the process. So people say, well, why didn't they just switch over? Why didn't they go into making raisins? Well, even the raisin country, was the Fresno area, was having a very poor time during this time anyway, not because they could make wine out of it. It's just it had did a market crash during that time. There's a lot of ads and trying to boost raisins, but it did not have anything to do with anything in Northern California, unless you had some table grapes that you grew in your behind your house on the sunny side. But basically, they found another workaround. So the Alicante Boucher is just another way they would put that also for fresh and send it east. So it was popular in the east, particularly because that had the pulp itself was red, and so people, even though those of you who know how the wine process works, it comes out white, it comes out clear, and so you have to do something to add the skins and all that kind of stuff in the fermenting process, so that you get the color of the grape that you color of the wine you want. And so they found a workaround, and I appreciate the fact that someone wrote it up for me, because I could not find that. I can't find that story online. All right, so the 4.4, we have another way of getting liquor, and this one surprised me, and this is moonshining. I assume moonshining to come from from the Ozarks, from Kentucky, all that kind of stuff. We did a lot of moonshining during Prohibition in the Bay Area. Even the bounty of the Bay Area of homemade liquor choices, there was a very active moonshining as well. Stills could be kitchen stove size to large and multiple, usually in rural areas, hidden behind the barn or an outbuilding, very common in both Marin and Sonoma County, and obviously any other county that you could put the ingredients together. You had to have the sugar, you had to have the other ingredients. The output was usually a grain alcohol, and it was a grain alcohol, so sometimes flavored to resemble gin or what they call jackass brandy, which might be with a little grape coloring in it and so forth, but I'm not sure. You'll read all the time it's jackass brandy, and it probably has nothing to do with brandy. It's just a name that carried forward. The results was a white lightning, not aged, and pretty potent stuff. The other one that I'll mention here is the grappa. Okay, among the northern Italians, grappa was very popular. This is the fifth pressing. So this is the end of the line. You've squeezed and squeezed your grape, and you now can get on one more product out of it by making grappa. It's made from you distill the pomace, so you're not distilling when you're doing wine, but this is where you distill it, which had the skins, the pulp, the seeds, the stems, after the initial grape had been pressed for wine. Grappa is usually served as an after-dinner drink, paired with desserts and fruit or pastry. So grappa was another very popular thing, and of course the northern Italians all knew how you make grappa. They used to make it back in Tuscany. I mean, that was just how it was all came down. A fifth issue, which was not very huge in Sonoma County, but definitely was in Marin, and this is the West Coast run-rumming trade. So the mothership, which was the basic load, would come down from Vancouver, bottled and done in real distilleries up in Vancouver. The Canadians went province by province coming back. Some provinces were very slow coming back, but boy, British Columbia and Quebec were the two to come back the fastest right after. They'd had a prohibition during the First World War, primarily because they were part of the empire, and a lot of men would be drafted and this kind of thing, and they want to keep the booze away from the boys, so they had prohibition for a brief time during the war from 1914-15 on, but they got out of it very quickly by the end of the war. So anyway, where was the destination? The destination was Mexico. So we got Vancouver to Mexico. Why? Because you had to stay in international waters. So 12 miles off, at one time it was 3 miles, but 12 miles out, you were safe. Nobody could touch you because you were beyond the international limits. The Mosquito Fleet, or Mosquito ships, they would call them. These are small, faster vessels who could go closer to the shore because of their draft, and they would then bring that ashore. If there was no proper dock, the Mosquito ship got as close to shore as possible and put the cache of their liquor in a gunny sack. Why a gunny sack? It's gunny sack with 12 bottles, whatever number of bottles, tied to a long line with a float every 10 feet or 6 feet, whatever, so that when you threw it off, if you had to throw it off and you couldn't get any closer, you could just let it go with the tide and follow the waves and land on the beach. And then you had somebody picking it up on the beach. So they're rather clever ways of doing it. Sometimes they knew they were going to go to a dock, and sometimes they could actually leave it in the box and offload it that way. But they're trying to, they're being surreptitious. They're trying to stay out of notice. San Mateo Coast was notorious. The whole area around Half Moon Bay, Pescadero, all through there was a lot of this kind of stuff. In Marin County, it would be Tamales Bay. If you move up from Marin into Sonoma, there's a whole bunch of dog holes in Sonoma County from Bodega up to Wallala, where you could do the same kind of thing. This was a very busy operation. However, the ship could sit out there by the Farallones for 3, 4, 5 months at a time, waiting for their Mosquito Fleet to come out and get their thing, get their booze. It was quality booze. It had the bill of lading had to say it's going from Vancouver, it's going to Mexico, give you a port and all this stuff. It was all fictitious. They didn't do that at all. Their plan was to sit out there in safe waters and provide hard liquor, usually gin or scotch. It wasn't bourbon. It was definitely European versions of liquor. We also had enforcement of the Volstead Act by the U.S. Coast Guard. And this they promised a lot and didn't deliver. They were using World War I ships that had been decommissioned. So they're probably decommissioned because their motors were not very effective, whatever else. And so they could not keep up with it with the Mosquito Fleet. The Mosquito Fleet was too fast, operating in the middle of the night or whatever. And the Coast Guard made a big thing. We're in charge. We're going to do this. We've been really helpful. It was all fictitious. Every liquor vessel is to be searched and watched and all this kind of stuff. It did not work. And later, by the time of 1927 or so, there was appropriations to get faster ships and that kind of thing. But one of the people who was very helpful in this process, it's the next slide. Okay. Anyway, so liquor sellers get 35 days in prison. Launch believed liquor smugglers. This is out of Tamales Bay. Rum runners seized while robbing. While robbers flee. Marin County's dry rays hit resorts. The same thing that went on in Sonoma County as well. What happened with the rum runners? They're still operating under at least that Right Act, in which the local sheriff could enforce if he so wished. He had an option, and it didn't. He could find workarounds for that as well. So, two most sensational cases that do come out of Marin, I could not find anything out of Sonoma County, was Herb Madden. So he was a mayor of Sausalito. He was a co-owner of Madden Lewis Boat Works. His specialty was high-speed ships, high-speed motorboats. And so what they did, they would have a drop portion of the thing. If they were being chased, they could drop the stuff and it would go to the bottom of the bay or the ocean, wherever else. There are all kinds of clever ways to keep this going. Well, anyway, He's a mayor. I mean, he's a pretty important person, and he is involved in an operation down in Moss Beach, down in San Mateo County, in which a sheriff gets killed and two innocent witnesses are dead. So we've got three deaths, are all associated with Madden. But Madden uh, wiggled and squirmed and so forth, but he gets convicted of his role in making this thing happen. He wasn't there at the site at the time. He gets 2 years at McNeil Island. Uh, he serves 18 months and comes back as a prominent citizen in Sausalito. So it's rather interesting that the taint of having something to do with prohibition just didn't go very far in this area. Um, Okay, so let's go through this thing again. There it is. Okay. The other one was Clint Mason. He was a Sausalito businessman. His family owned Mason's Distillery. They all, during Prohibition, they had a contract with the authorities to make a certain amount of alcohol for medicinal purposes or for rubbing alcohol or whatever else they did. They were not to make anything beyond that. The other side of his distillery, he ran a garage, and he used the bottling line to make soda water bottles and so forth. Mason, I just point him out because he was involved. That's a picture of his operation here in Sausalito. Mason's Distillery, so it was on Bridgeway. Anyway, he's involved in a situation where there's a huge still out by Marshall. It's hidden behind the trees and so forth, but there was double still producing a lot of liquor. He's involved in that. But one of the people in this case is involved with another woman, and the husband finds out about it and shoots this man. And of course, there goes the witness. So Mason walked because the jury couldn't find him guilty based upon the fact that he knew all about this operation of bootlegging going out of Marshall, but they couldn't pin it on him because the only person who could finger him was dead. All right. So enforcement of the Volstead Act, and that's just the legislation that went on, is kind of like an episode of the Keystone Cops. They're bumblers. They bump into each other. Local enforcement was helpful to some degree, but in many cases, they knew people. Outsiders came into their county. Yeah, they might get tough with them, but the locals, no, they looked out for each other. I have a family story. My mother came from northern Minnesota. The local sheriff would bust somebody. He'd bring the White Lightning or whatever else he'd brought behind the barn with my grandfather, and they sat there and they tasted it and they talked about good old times. Both of them were breaking the law, but neither of them were going to get caught because the sheriff just brought the product over that he just busted somebody. So this whole process, if you have a country, a state or a country that is not going along with the program, it's very hard to enforce just about anything. And so there was violence. There was some, fines that were applied to people. Some people actually did have to pay good money for their involvement, but in most cases, outside of a person who was involved, where there was deaths and so forth, and involved in a bigger racket, nobody went to prison or nobody did any more than county jail. So that would, and some would only go as far as San Rafael. It would definitely not be brought to San Francisco for any kind of a trial. So H.L. Mencken, 1925, had a few things to say about that. There is not less drunkenness in the Republic, but more. Not less crime, but more. There is not less insanity, but more. The cost of government is not smaller, but vastly greater. Respect for the law has not increased, it has diminished. You can't legalize morality. The Prohibition years from 1920 to 1933 were an ignoble experiment that failed, but in the Bay Area, they certainly had a style about them, and they definitely a style all their own. They found a workaround in most cases. And saying anything else about the local scene, I could not find anything that was really sounded like anything that I'd heard from other big cities like Chicago, where there was Al Capone and that kind of thing. Same thing with Detroit had an amazing reputation because they were right across from Windsor, Ontario, and of course the ships came out with good Kentucky, good Canadian whiskey, came across in boats at night and all that kind of stuff. And then someone got ahead of someone else, and someone got shot. And it was a very, very wide open town. Didn't go on in the Bay Area. It did not go on, definitely in Sonoma or Marin County. And that, I think, is, I'm ready for questions.
So if anyone has a question, please unmute yourself. We'd like to hear from you. Well, it doesn't look like we have any questions. I can tell you that I've lived in San Luis Obispo County for many years, and I had an older friend who said that you got a notice that to leave the keys in your car at night, and the car was driven up to San Simeon, near where there's a Hearst Pier, and it was used to transport, and you'd have a gift in your car when it got back in the morning.
Right.
And also locally here, there were dairies, and so there were cans and cans of milk that went into San Francisco. And what do you think some of the cans had? Absolutely.
They went on that Sausalito ferry. Exactly how it all worked. There is stuff written about that kind of thing. Milk cans. There's also the Sausalito ferry. There was a specific time that they knew they could get away with it, so they quite often used the last ferry, and everybody was looking the other way. So there was stuff, trapdoors out of Valhalla. There was all that kind of stuff, but they didn't have to work as hard as someone in another community would have had to work to pull this off. Los Angeles was a lot more righteous about this. The area was just not righteous. They found workarounds. So.
Well, unless someone else has a question, I want to thank you. This has been.
I actually have a question.
Oh, okay.
Earlier, before the presentation, which I enjoyed greatly, thank you. You had mentioned the drop in the number of wineries in Sonoma.
Right.
I was wondering if you could go over that number again, as
Sure.
well as, do you know what the drop was, if any, in the actual production of grapes in Sonoma during that time?
Well, here's my figures. I have from before in the early 20s, just before Prohibition, there were 256 wineries in Sonoma County. 256. By 1933, it was down to less than 50. Okay. By 1960, 5. Now we know what happens after that. We have learned a lot. I have a brother-in-law who's got a winery in Napa. I've heard some of his stories from his father-in-law that came down. They had to find a way around it. And it's not until what happens in the 1960s that they start discovering a lot of things that they can grow grapes. Number one is don't use the valley. Stay out of the valley, because when that frost comes in March or so, it'll take out your crop. And so wind machines were found to be very ineffective. And so when they went to drip, that would encapsulate each of those clusters of grapes that are growing, and the temperature between outside and inside that capsule was enough variance that most of the time you saved your crop. So it became very, but it became very, very, a lot of new technology and new thinking went into it. They finally figured out a rootstock that would not be taken out by that little lout we call phylloxera. Those little things that went into it, but its culture had changed post-war. during Prohibition and post-Prohibition, definitely into the Second World War, it was the quicker liquor that was getting the bang for the buck. So many people were drinking mixed drinks, very popular in the 30s if you could afford it, and that kind of stuff. So it was not a popular thing. It was pretty much relegated to upstate New York and here in California, and it just had to evolve on its own. So, did I miss any part of that, Robert?
No, I think you addressed it. Thank you.
Okay.
And I have a question from Betsy. Many reports talk about the high rate of alcoholism across the country pre-Prohibition. Are there any reports that discuss alcoholism in wine country at that time? And
my general impression is, and I can't do anything factual on this one, is that the people who were interested in wine were the Italians primarily, and you had a lot of Italians who were working in those. You know, some came in for dairy, but some stayed around for other things. A lot of dairy was Portuguese as well. So these were people who used it as something that you had with your meal, and so that changes the whole dynamic. It's part of their culture to have it with a meal. The young child is given mostly water and a couple of drops of wine. I mean, this is kind of a cultural thing. You can't take that away from people by imposing a national rule that might be fine if you live in Paducah, Kentucky, but it doesn't work very well. Or let's take it even more, it was Ohio or any of those states that were pretty blue nose about alcohol. And even in Kentucky, they're making white lightning and stills all the time. So there's a lot of hypocrisy about the whole process. But my general feeling from everything that I've read is that there wasn't more imbibing because it did not have the taint of the forbidden fruit. The forbidden fruit syndrome is definitely there. And if you're living in Kansas, it's forbidden fruit. So you got to be very, very sneaky to get it. It was wide open and people were discreet, but they were not using alcohol as something to get drunk and disorderly as much as you would if you were in an area which treated alcohol differently than we did. There was a moment there where they tried to leach legislation to get beer and wine off of the major list, because they're saying it's much better for people, it's healthier, and it's not something it's not going to get you drunk. Obviously, that's an exaggeration. That was their political game, but the consideration was that beer and wine were for refreshment, not for getting drunk. That hard liquor was for getting drunk. So that's the way they tried to play it. It didn't work. The Calvin Coolidges of the day were still going to use it, put it all under one umbrella. So it didn't work. So if I extrapolate those two pieces, I think we did very well in far as the Bay Area was concerned, particularly the locals. Now, people always came as visitors to San Francisco. We're always looking for a drink because they could, and be wide open about it, but not. It wouldn't work for Marin and Sonoma. It really wouldn't.